kind of funny because the RTX 4080 just launched this week, and you can check out my review if you're interested, but at $1,200 MSRP, according to online reports, the 4080 isn't exactly flying off the shelves like some of the other NVIDIA offerings of late. And I think there's a pretty good reason for that. It is the price. At $1,200, it is a Halo tier product and not something that everyone can afford. You have to have deep pockets. So if you're going to be spending upwards of $1,000 on a graphics card, would you go for the $1,200 RTX 4080 or the $1,600 to $1,800 RTX 4090? Chances are, if you're that kind of person, you're going to spend the extra cash to get the fastest graphics card that's currently available, which is why the 4090 is still in short supply, whereas the 4080 is still available. And it is for that reason, and definitely not because I'm way behind on my work and I should have posted this video 2 weeks ago, that today I'm bringing you guys a double feature review yet again of two RTX 4090s. From ASUS, we have the TUF OC, and from Colorful, we have the iGame VULCAN OC-V. And my focus today is going to be on what manufacturers can do to possibly differentiate themselves to make their card look different and special versus the Founders Edition.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Kioxia's ever-expanding family of high-performance SSDs, featuring their latest VIX 3D flash memory. The XG8 Client M.2 SSD is now available in capacities up to 4 terabytes, with up to 7 gigabytes per second sequential read speeds, and for enterprise or hyperscale data center use, consider the CD8, which supports PCI Express 5.0, or the XD7P, which leverages the thermal and performance benefits of the E1.S form factor, ideal for pairing with the latest AMD EPYC or Intel Xeon server hardware. For more on Kioxia SSDs, click the sponsor link in the video description. Okay, I'm going to start off with the ASUS TUF OC RTX 4090, then I will cover the colorful iGame VULCAN. There are timestamps in the description if you want to jump to one or the other, and then I have some cumulative comparisons of these cards, as well as a couple other RTX 4090s that I covered a couple weeks back, the MSI Suprim Liquid X and the Gigabyte Gaming OC. So I'm going to start off with my biggest gripe about this graphics card because it's a pretty big one, and I think it's one that will deter a lot of people from the get-go, or possibly just point you in a different direction. Here are the ASUS RTX 4090s available at Newegg. I guess I should say not available because they're all sold out, including the ones that are $2,000, the Strix models. But those are for rich people and more poor people, so we have a TUF OC. But note, the TUF is available in a couple different varieties, the not OC and the OC. And the only difference between these two cards is literally a 60 hertz overclock from the stock specs that the Founders Edition ships at. And I'm going to tell you guys a little secret. You can easily do an overclock that much or even beyond that just by using some basic software like the ASUS GPU Tweak software or MSI's Afterburner. And that will make this card that costs $1,600 perform the exact same as this card, the OC version, which is $200 frickin' more. And ASUS, it's just such a huge markup for the OC version. And I have a feeling that you're probably going to make a lot more of these than the $1,600 variant. Of course, that's just my speculation, but for anyone who's watching this, get the $1,600 versions of the 4090s because the markups for these more expensive ones, at least in terms of performance, are often really just not worth it. So aesthetically, the TUF OC may or may not be your cup of tea. It has a bit of a utilitarian look with a dark gray shroud and pretty minimal RGB lighting. There's just one RGB accent point right here at the corner, which of course you could disable if you weren't into RGB. So for people who are looking for something that's a little bit less of the gamer aesthetic, this might be the way to go. It is of course still a massive card, as most of the RTX 4090s are. It's a quad slot card, so it's going to take up at least 4 slots in your case, and it is 13.7 inches long. That's at 348 millimeters, by the way. It is also 6.3 inches tall, which is fairly tall, and it also has the 12VH power connector right here on the side, so that's going to stick out a little bit, so you might want to make sure you have enough width in your case as well. It's also 2.9 inches thick, which is your 4-slot spacing, and it has a 450 watt TDP. They're recommending an 850 watt power supply at minimum for a system with an RTX 4090 in it. So what has ASUS done to differentiate this card from the Founders Edition? Well, first of all, they've designed their own cooler, which is larger and should work a little bit better, and I'll get to those numbers in just a moment. Another value add that they've integrated is a dual BIOS switch, and you can see here there's a quiet mode and a performance mode. Incidentally, all of my testing today was done in performance mode, but whether you're using that to switch between the default settings or you're loading custom VBIOSes, that is a pretty handy add-on to have. That said, lots of RTX 4090s do have that because they all are $1,600 or more, which is a premium tier for a graphics card in terms of pricing. The other add-on or upgrade versus the Founders Edition ASUS has made is they've given you one extra HDMI port. So that is HDMI 2.1. That slightly makes up for the fact that all the display ports on this card are 1.4A. And again, that may or may not have value for you depending on how many monitors you're planning to connect, but it is convenient. For example, if you have an HDMI 2.1 monitor you want to plug in, and then you want to route another one over to like a 4K TV or something like that. That said, let's get into some gaming performance, and we're testing Cyberpunk 2077, running at 4K with the Ray Traced Ultra preset. And you can see the stats on screen as I was running around the test area. The typical gaming fan speed by default, again with that performance VBIOS, is about 40 to 42%, and that's about 1350 to 1400 RPMs, which is nice and quiet. The GPU clock was at between 2730 and 2760 megahertz, and the GPU core temperatures were in the low 60s, with the memory hitting about 70 degrees Celsius. We were getting between 40 and 44 frames per second with the Ray Traced Ultra preset here, which is right in line with the other RTX 4090s that I've tested, and our GPU power draw was between 410 and 420 watts. From there, I switched over to some overclocking, and I'm trying to maintain some regularity between my settings here. So the first thing I did was set the fan speed to 80%, and then maxed out the power limit, and then adjusted the core and memory clocks to be as high as they could go while staying stable while running the test. For the TUF OC, I was able to dial in a plus 180 megahertz core clock offset that resulted in a 2735 megahertz boost clock, and we had plus 1350 on the memory, which was running at 1481 megahertz. Unfortunately, the TUF OC that I got was not the best overclocker. I would say it fell to the bottom of the pack in terms of the frequencies it was able to hit versus the other 4090s that I've tested. It did get to 2955 megahertz peak, not quite breaking the 3 gigahertz barrier. But with that overclock dialed in, getting back into Cyberpunk 2077 again with the Ray Traced Ultra preset. And by the way, I'm running the game for a 20-minute run before I capture the footage that you're seeing on screen right now. We were hitting 2940 megahertz in terms of clock speeds. The GPU power draw was up to 445 to 470 watts, and we did get a little bit of a boost in our frame rate to 41 to 48 frames per second. Not huge, but the overclocking potential for these RTX 4090s seems to be fairly minimal. It's generally about 5%, which is reflected in the increased frame rate. Meanwhile, because I set that fixed 80% fan speed, our temperatures actually went down. The GPU was in the 56 to 60 degrees Celsius range, with the memory getting a little bit warmer than that, around 62 to 64. And with the fan set to 80%, that was resulting in an actual RPM of about 2500. Now, because it's frustrating to see an RTX 4090 that costs $1,600 or $1,800 only getting in the low 40s in terms of frame rate, albeit with Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K, with ray tracing and everything maxed out in terms of eye candy, I decided to also do a run with DLSS balanced mode turned on, which actually reduces some of the load on the GPU. We were still hitting about the same frequency, 2940 megahertz, but the GPU power draw actually dropped a bit to 365 to 385 watts. DLSS balanced mode does have a minor hit in terms of image quality, but we were getting much higher frame rates, around 75 to 90 FPS. Meanwhile, the GPU was between 50 and 53 degrees Celsius, memory at 56 to 58C, and again, that's because the fans are cranked up and also pretty loud. And our other RTX 4090 today is this one from Colorful, the iGame VULCAN OC-V. And this one immediately started to stand out in a few different ways. First of all, Colorful sent this Lego kit. It's actually not Legos, but it's the Lego style bricks, but it's a computer, and I haven't taken this out or built it yet, but I think I should very soon. Perhaps I can build this during our charity live stream or something, but that actually doesn't come with this graphics card. It was just a little bonus thing that Colorful sent over. And that's not to say that this card doesn't have a lot of other ways that it stands out and makes itself unique, but the first thing I tried to do is figure out how much this would actually cost if RTX 4090s were in stock and available at MSRP. And that's difficult for me to figure out because Colorful is based in China. They actually don't distribute their cards very widely in the US. So this card just isn't listed with a retail price at US-based websites like Newegg.com. That said, I was able to suss out from a few online reviews and articles like Tweaktown that the MSRP for this card is supposed to be $1,770. $1,770, which is actually $30 cheaper than the ASUS TUF OC, but again, availability is sort of questionable, so it's hard to say for sure how much you could buy this card for if you were really trying to get one. But this card immediately starts to differentiate itself as soon as you open the retail box, where you're greeted with this tray of pretty cool accessories. And there are some that are necessary, like with the ASUS card, you get a 12 VH power to 4 8-pin PCI Express power adapter cable. There's some specialty accessories like this cable, which plugs into the card and then has a USB and an RGB LED header, so you can sync the RGB LEDs from your motherboard and the card. And it allows you to upload your own images to the included LCD panel. by the way, there is an included LCD panel. It's a small rectangular full color LCD similar to the one that I looked at in the RTX 3080 Vulcan from Colorful that I reviewed however long ago that was. This time they've changed up the design to make it a little bit more useful and a little bit more flexible. They actually include two RGB panels in the box. This one here that's a little bit slimmer and has kind of a V shape at the bottom, and then the full LCD screen. And then you might also notice that the card itself has 8 contact pins along this one edge, as well as a couple little plastic pieces to hold the thing in place. So you can take your pick. If you just want some RGB accents and the Vulcan logo, you can just snap that one right on there. And yes, you can do this on the fly while the card is up and running. Or you can attach this LCD panel, which can show a stylized Vulcan logo, or it can show system stats, or like I said, you can upload your own images or GIFs to it. And this actually has 2 orientations. It can lay flat against the side of the card like this, or it can rotate 90 degrees so it sort of sticks out from the side. So if you have a vertical GPU mount or a side GPU mount like I did in the Thermaltake Tower 100 when I did a build with the 3080 version of this card, you can have it stand out and be visible for you. But if you do just want to go with this Vulcan attachment right there, they've also included a USB breakout box. Or I guess I should say dock. It just has a braided USB cable, this little dock, and again, you can snap that on right there. So you could position this outside your case in front of your monitor, for example, if you wanted a better view of the stats that are on there, or you could even position it inside your case up against the window, wherever you might want to stick it. I did note that if you're putting the LCD screen on the card itself, unfortunately you can't just take your Vulcan logo and stick it on there. I don't know, that would be kind of cool. It's just a little bit too wide to fit on. And again, this may or may not be useful for you. Some people are all about those LCD integrations that you can put inside your case. There's lots of different ways to do it, and if you're planning on something like that, then getting this along with your graphics card might be a valuable value add for you. Ultimately though, it is just an aesthetic add-on, so it doesn't really affect your performance. Rounding out the accessories though, there were a few more things. They do have a stand that's in a similar stand style for GPU sag, or to combat GPU sag, since this is in fact a quite substantial GPU and among the heaviest of the RTX 4090s that I've tested. They also included a small screwdriver, which is nice to have, and these gloves. So you can give your GPU install the white glove treatment, although I will say they're a little bit small for my hands. Okay, the card itself though has a pretty nice design, I would say. If you're into like the look of the ASUS Strix cards, this is in the same general ballpark. It is again a 4-slot cooler. It is actually very similar to the ASUS card in terms of size. It measures just a little bit shorter. It is a 3-fan cooler with a blade design that connects the blades out at the blade tips, which can provide a little bit more durability in terms of accidentally breaking a fan blade. And just to note, whereas a lot of coolers have this center fan spin in the opposite direction as the 2 outer fans, all 3 of these fans spin in the same direction. There are no extra video outs on the rear of the card. It still has your 3 DisplayPort 1.4s and your HDMI 2.1. However, this card does also have a dual V-BIOS. It's just in a slightly different format. There's an actual button that you push on the back of the card that says it's a turbo mode. When you push it in and engage it, the light will turn on. You can do that while the system is on, but you'll need to restart the system to actually load into the second V-BIOS. And interestingly enough, that other V-BIOS actually has a different power limit. The stock V-BIOS on this card has a 450 watt power limit. You can do up to 106% power limit when you're overclocking. That brings it up to 480 watts. The Turbo BIOS boosts that up to 515 watts, and then if you max that out to 106%, that gets you up to 550 watts, which is actually still a little bit short of the maximum allowable by NVIDIA at 600 watts. So I'd be interested to see how this card performs with maybe a custom V-BIOS that can make use of all of that power. That said, here's a look at gaming performance once again with Cyberpunk 2077 running at 4K with the Ray Traced Ultra preset. This is typical performance after about 20 minutes of gaming, and again, that's with the Turbo V-BIOS enabled. The fan speed was at 47%, which is about 1800 RPM. GPU clock speeds are around 2775 to 2820 megahertz, and the GPU temperature was between 61 and 64 degrees Celsius, with the memory getting up to 66 degrees Celsius. We were hitting about 39 to 44 frames per second with the Ray Traced Ultra preset, again, pretty much the exact same as all the other 4090s that I've tested. And our GPU power draw was in the 435 to 445 watt range. From there, I again switched to overclocking, setting the fans to 80% speed, maxing the power limit, which again is 106% on this card, 550 watts with that Turbo V-BIOS. Did plus 155 on the core clock, getting it to 2780 megahertz boost, and plus 1325 on the memory clock, getting it up to 1478. With those settings, back in Cyberpunk, we were hitting 2970 megahertz clock speed, about 485 to 495 watts in terms of GPU power draw, and the frame rate again boosted by roughly 5% to 41 to 50. frames per second. Again, with those fan speeds cranked up, our temperatures actually went down with the GPU in the 57 to 59 degrees Celsius range, the memory at 60%, and I will say the fans in this card can run pretty high. At 80%, they were at 2900 RPM. At 100%, they go all the way up to 3500 RPM. So as you'll see in a moment, the noise levels for this card were a little bit higher than some of the others that I tested. Then I switched to the DLSS balanced preset one more time. That got the clock speed up just a little bit to 2985 megahertz. GPU power draw was down a little bit to 385 to 400 watts. We were getting about 78 to 95 frames per second, and the GPU temperature was about 50 to 52 degrees Celsius with the memory at 54 degrees Celsius. And now let's look at some comparison charts comparing all the RTX 4090s that I've tested thus far. I want to start off by pointing out the ASUS 4090 TUF OC, the manufacturer overclock, not the manual overclock that I did. The GPU boost clock there is 2565 megahertz. Compare that to the Founders Edition at 2520. I think I said it was a 60 megahertz overclock before. It's actually a 45 megahertz overclock. So again, that's what you're getting for $200 with the TUF OC versus just paying $1,600 for the non-OC version and overclocking it yourself. Also, in terms of max OC for the cards I tested today, the iGame VULCAN got up to 3015 megahertz. That was with my manual overclock. However, that still wasn't enough to surpass the MSI 4090 Suprim Liquid X, which, to be fair, is using a liquid cooler. Next, we'll take a look at temperatures. And again, if my manual overclock temperatures look weird because the temperatures are lower, that's because the fans are running at a much higher RPM, which will also be reflected in the acoustic test, which I'll get to in just a moment. At stock though, between the Colorful card and the ASUS card, it's pretty much a wash. The Colorful had slightly lower hotspot GPU temperatures, but slightly higher max core temps. And while pretty much all of the third-party cards that I've tested showed some degree of improvement over the Founders Edition, note that pretty much no card is getting higher than 80 degrees Celsius on the hotspot, and even much less than that on the core temperatures. The only standout here for you might be the MSI Suprim Liquid X, but do note that that card was requested back by MSI, and I've returned it to them, and they've now sent it back to me. It actually just arrived yesterday, and they said that there was an assembly issue with the thermal pads on the memory for that card, which has been fixed, and as reflected in some other reviews of the MSI Suprim Liquid X, the memory temperatures are just fine and well in line with the other 4090s that have been tested. Here's a look at peak power draw numbers. As you might expect, when you overclock, you tend to draw more power, especially if you're upping that power limit. And do note that some cards can go all the way up to the 600 watt power limit, like the Gigabyte RTX 4090 Gaming, which is why the power draw on that peaked at about 550 watts, versus some of the other cards that are staying close to 500 watts or even in the high 400s. Here are my acoustic comparisons between the cards running the fans at 40%, 70%, and 100% fan speeds. Note that 100% fan speed is pretty ridiculous. It's quite loud and it is not very practical. And also note that my office here is not the best testing environment in terms of acoustics. I have a noise floor that's around 41 or 42 dBA, so I haven't recorded anything below that. That said, the Colorful 4090 iGame VULCAN at 40% was the only other card besides the Founders Edition that actually registered above the noise floor. And it was also the loudest card at 70% and at 100% fan speed. Again though, while you're actually gaming and using the card at stock settings and not trying to overclock and set some fixed fan speed, the Colorful card did not stand out notably as being extremely loud during typical testing. And switching over to a couple comparison game tests, starting off with 3D Mark Times by Extreme. And here the Colorful, I suppose, makes up a little bit for being a little bit louder in my testing by getting the maximum graphics score out of all the cards that I tested, while manually overclocked, of course, hitting 21,020, barely edging out the MSI Suprim Liquid X OC. And here are my numbers for Cyberpunk 2077. This is with the Ultra preset with ray tracing turned off. And here pretty much all the cards hit around 80, 81 FPS when not overclocked, and then got up to about 85 or 86 FPS when I did the manual OC. And that pretty much sums up my testing for these two new cards, as well as all the RTX 4090s that I've gotten my hands on so far. In closing, I would like to say that NVIDIA has actually made it pretty difficult for their vendor partners to stand out from the crowd with their GPUs because they're limited in terms of what they can do for overclocking as well as power limits. I think for some people, paying a bit extra for items that add value in terms of accessories such as the LCD display for the Colorful VULCAN, I definitely think that a $200 increase versus the $1,600 MSRP is not worth it for something like the ASUS TUF OC. Chances are they're selling those cards simply because it's all that's available versus a lot of people who would much rather get the $1,600 card and are perfectly capable of dialing in a 45 megahertz megahertz overclock themselves. And finally, just as a contrast to the much more recently launched RTX 4080, I feel like the 4090 does have a bit more desirability because anyone who does have that amount of money to spend on a graphics card is probably going to want the best one that they can get right now versus capping it at $1,200 and getting something that is notably less in terms of performance. But hopefully this video, as well as my other one on the Gigabyte and MSI card, has helped you make a decision if you are considering seriously buying an RTX 4090, and I'll post links to these cards down in the description below. You can also check the description below for a link to my store at paulshardware.net, where you can buy shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and now available for almost the first time for the past week or so, these water bottles that I got the thumb screw logo on them. These are actually Arctic stainless steel water bottles, and I've been using this one for several months now, and I can vouch for it that it's like really awesome. I love drinking out of it. It keeps stuff really cold, and I use it all the time. You should also use the like button all the time for videos of mine that you watch that you like. Maybe consider clicking that. And of course, if you're not subscribed to my channel, consider subscribing for more tech videos coming at you really soon. Thanks again for watching this video, you guys, and we'll see you in the next one.